You're listening to the Doctors In podcast from martinclinic.com. Although we share a lot of practical and, in our opinion, awesome information, what you hear on this podcast is not intended to diagnose, cure, treat, or prevent any disease. It's strictly for informational purposes. So enjoy. Hello, I'm Dr. Martin Jr.
I'm Dr. Martin Sr.
And this is the Doctors In podcast, and this is episode 155. And today we want to kind of continue a discussion that we had on our previous podcast where we talked specifically about cortisol. Now, if you haven't listened to that one, don't worry, we're going to recap some of what we talked about before. But what we want to do today is really show you how cortisol, for a lot of people, really starts all of their problems.
Yeah, it really messes you up. It messes you up metabolically. And the reason is, if you think of what cortisol is, again, just to give you a little refresher, is cortisol is a hormone that your adrenal glands secrete in response to the fight or flight. It's the cousin of adrenaline, and it's long-lasting, and it really has a major effect on, we talked about it last week. Its main job is to get you ready for fight or flight. So what's it do? It elevates your insulin, right?
Yeah, it brings up your blood sugar levels.
Your blood sugar, and your insulin is secreted in response to that, right?
Now, we had a few questions about the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. And
we don't like getting in the weeds, but we'll get in the weeds
for a
second.
Just real quickly. So from a practical standpoint, you kind of have two different, I want to say, kind of systems that you can go back and forth between, right? It's the one is the rest and digest stage. So your biochemistry, your hormones, everything that is necessary for resting and digesting is taking over, right? And then you have another stage where it's your fight or flight. And so everything happens for that reason. So if you think about the difference, when you're resting, you need less energy, right? So your hormones that bring up your blood sugar levels so that you have more energy are not really all that active because you don't need the energy. However, when you're in that fight or flight mode, then hormones like cortisol are way more active because they're bringing up your blood sugar levels. And so there's a lot that goes on physiologically. Now, from the rest and digest standpoint, obviously that's crucial for a healthy digestive system. So you can imagine that's when you're secreting digestive enzymes. That's when all those things that are involved in breaking down food are doing the job.
Your feel-good hormones are out big time.
Exactly. You're not stressed. So you can imagine if somebody has elevated cortisol all the time, what it does eventually to their digestive system, right? Yeah. It absolutely can destroy it. It can cause a whole whack of problems.
It's a diversion because what happens with cortisol as it gets you to not even, like you're not thinking of digestion. If you were getting chased by a bear or whatever, right, or something, like the last thing you want to do is eat, right? Like all you're thinking of is, and that's why you see symptoms, and we might have touched a little bit on that last week. You see symptoms of a lot of people that have high cortisol over a long period of time, they become nauseous. Like even at the thought of food, they're nauseated. And so they got that sort of...
And yet they can't lose weight.
Yet they can't lose weight. And then they have cravings. So if there is going to be food, give me something quick. Like just give me a fix. Give me sugar or give me salt or give me sugar and salt.
Yeah, it's like chocolate and potato chips kind of summarize some
like
of the cravings.
Because I am like, and that's just your body being diverted. And, it's interesting how those two systems work. And if you're feeling real good and you're in real good health, and nothing's going on, I mean, these two things, you're not even thinking about it. They just happen automatically.
And what's interesting then is high cortisol is also, as we talked about last week, is a major cause, obviously, of insomnia. And what we did last week was kind of talk about the fact that cortisol is a cyclical hormone and it kind of follows your circadian rhythm, meaning there's a definite pattern based on the time of day that hormone is supposed to be active naturally, right? You have a higher level of cortisol as you're waking up in the morning, and then it kind of goes down the rest of the day after. And it makes sense because...
And really low when you go to sleep.
Yeah, cortisol, it's like you're in that rest and digest phase completely, right? Yeah. So you should be... Cortisol is very low. at nighttime, and that's normal. So it's higher in the morning. It's raising your blood sugar levels up, which is why, interesting enough, a lot of diabetics have a hard time with sugar regulation, blood sugar regulation in the morning. And a lot of it is that circadian rhythm, right? It's that cortisol. So you have a diabetic, and then you throw on a real high cortisol, and then it just creates a real morning issue for them, right? And you see that a lot of times, which is why a lot of diabetics, when we talk about fasting, research has shown, and we've heard this and seen this many times, that a diabetic is actually better to fast at the end of the day. So they actually would eat in the morning, and they would stop eating kind of around 4 in the afternoon, and they tend to do really well that way. Whereas a diabetic fasting till lunch can have a hard time because they already have high cortisol levels. And anyways, it's really interesting stuff, right? It's amazing how some hormones are directly tied to our circadian rhythm. For example, growth hormone is mainly secreted while we're sleeping at nighttime. It's a nighttime hormone. Yeah. So if growth hormone,
you better be sleeping.
You better be in the right cycles of sleep, as well, the right stages. And growth hormone is what keeps you young. It's that anti-aging hormone, right? People inject it. They spend a lot of money getting growth hormone injections as they age, because that naturally decreases as you age. And a lot of people call it kind of that fountain of youth, right? So needless to say, you secrete it at nighttime. Now, if you have high cortisol and you're not sleeping, you're not secreting human growth hormone, which is why cortisol, especially elevated cortisol, is a massive, we call it an accelerant. We use that word a lot. Yeah. It's an accelerant of aging. It ages you a lot faster because not only does cortisol cause inflammation, which can then lead to a whole bunch of bad things for your brain, your heart, your bodies, your joints, your skin, everything. It also will affect how you sleep, which will then decrease your human growth hormone secretion, which then means you're going to be aging faster. So it's an accelerant of aging as well. A lot of people don't realize this, that if they just concentrated on cortisol, they would have, that's one of the best anti-aging things that you can do.
Absolutely. And that's why, in a sense, too, that we talk about, you just mentioned heart, right? And a lot of times where men's cortisol is very high, a little bit different in women. Not that, well, you know what? You see, because if it's an accelerant of aging, think of what happens in aging. We talk about this in the past, like where you get much more inflammation, right? You don't get a good sleep. You get, you don't get growth hormone. One of the ways it ages you is because you're creating a lot more free radical damage. The body doesn't have time to repair because when you really think of it, like I always tell people, look, I mean, I don't know you know this. I don't have to tell you, but I don't know much about my phone, right? You know that. I'm upside down. When I do Facebook, like that, you're upside down, you don't know. And I say, well, why didn't you tell me that? How do I know?
And in all honesty, what raises my cortisol level is if you call me with a computer question. That elevates my cortisol. I go from rest and digest right into fight or flight.
Okay, now enough about me. Let me tell, just because I want to give this illustration. If you ever go on your phone and you go into airplane mode, what does that do to your phone? You're not getting no data's coming. No, you're not using data, right?
Nothing. I mean, you're not Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, everything gets shut off.
It gets shut off. So that's the way it's supposed to be with sleep, right? Your body, so think of cortisol keeps you out of the airplane mode on your phone. Your battery's being used and you're not even sleeping. So a lot of people, they have this symptom. You know what? I fell asleep, but I couldn't stay asleep. Because all of a sudden, you see, the cortisol's waking them up. Or they might have to go to the bathroom, which is, if you're a little bit older as a man or even women.
Yeah, and research has shown that if you fall back to sleep within a few minutes, it doesn't affect you.
Right?
But a lot of people, then they're up after because they can't fall back asleep again.
And I get people, talking to me all the time about that. And, it's so common, right? So anyway.
Cortisol, that's what it does with the rest and digest and the fight or flight stage and how it really can mess up a lot of different systems in your body. However, and we talked about what happens in the last episode when your cortisol's high all day, you can't sleep. We've mentioned a bunch of symptoms like exhaustion and stuff like that. But what we want to do for the rest of this episode is we want to basically show you how that process of elevated cortisol, which is so common, can absolutely destroy your hormones altogether. But before we do that, I just want to kind of add one little comment to something you said about in men specifically. One of the problems, and we're going to talk about the hormones that really affect women coming up here in a second, but really quickly, a man who has elevated cortisol, like you said, it goes to their heart differently. It goes, but you know, one of the other things it does, when cortisol is elevated, you're not making testosterone.
Yeah.
Right? One of the biggest problems that men have today is their testosterone levels are just way too low.
Yeah.
So it just affects all aspects of their well-being.
And
right?
a lot of people think that just on the thought of testosterone is that as you get older, your testosterone should be sinking like the Titanic. No, it shouldn't. Not if you're taking care of yourself.
No, and that's the thing. At one point that was taught was that you lose a certain percentage every year of testosterone. But what they found in research now is that that's not true, that if it does decrease, it's more likely due to lifestyle than actual age. So it is interesting. So that was an aside for men. Yeah. It affects their testosterone. Now, in women, and this is what makes it really interesting, is once cortisol is elevated, it's an accelerant. It affects their sleep. It accelerates their aging. It accelerates inflammation, but it also will tear apart their hormonal system, right? So let's talk about one of the most common complaints that women have about hormones is, and it's one of the top Googled, if you do a search query for hormones, is the thyroid.
Thyroid,
right? And
isn't it interesting how women know it's thyroid, right?
Well, they know it's thyroid because they have every symptom of thyroid. Yeah. Then they get frustrated because they get the blood test on the thyroid comes back normal. And we talk about that a fair amount. But one of the reasons for that is because they have a cortisol problem masquerading as a thyroid problem. Yeah. And the thyroid is being affected. Make no mistake about it. Yeah. However, they got a cortisol issue that's coming across as a thyroid issue, right? Because cortisol, what happens, and it's interesting. So if you look at cortisol really hurts your thyroid 3 ways. Now let's talk quickly about the thyroid. Let's just talk quickly about the thyroid.
What is it?
Yeah, the importance of it, right? It's a lot of times it's referred to as your master gland because it kind of it can influence the
orchestra leader.
Yeah, that's exactly it. That's a great analogy. Every instrument is being affected by the leader, the conductor. That's the thyroid gland. When the thyroid is functioning normal, your body is normal. When it's sluggish, everything is sluggish, right? I use the analogy of, like, I remember as kids, well, not even kids, sometimes just even going with your kids, you go to a go-kart park, right? Yeah. And you always want to race, right? Especially a lot of guys, they want to race. And I remember even racing my kids when they're a little older at these go-kart parks. But here's the thing. They all got little governors on them, right? Which are things that kind of keep the speed down. And if your governor is on more than somebody else's, it doesn't matter how hard you press that gas pedal, you're going to go slower than everybody else. And it can be frustrating if you're racing. I remember as a kid getting in, it was like 6 of us. We get into these go-karts and we all hammer the acceleration. They take off and I'm like, it didn't matter what I did. I wasn't going to catch them because mine was slower. My governor was working too well. It was sluggish, right? Yeah. And that's like a thyroid. Yeah. When the thyroid is sluggish, it doesn't matter how hard you're pushing the gas pedal in a sense. Yeah. It doesn't work. And it does that with every aspect of your body, from your metabolism to digestion to hair falling out. It's amazing. But what's fascinating is that a lot of people have thyroid because of their cortisol is high. And here's what's interesting. Cortisol will affect the thyroid in 3 different ways, like 3 big ways, right? One way is that it lowers TSH. Cortisol directly will lower TSH production. Yeah. And TSH, again, we always say this about the thyroid. The thyroid is kind of like a puppet. It only does what it's told to do. And it's told by your pituitary and your hypothalamus, right? Hypothalamus tells your pituitary, and then pituitary will tell your thyroid. And one of the ways that they communicate is with this TSH hormone. Yeah. TSH, what does it mean? Well, literally,
thyroid stimulating hormone.
When that thing's there, it stimulates your hormones to get to work. It wasn't the name, it's TSH. It sounds cool, but like a lot of things in medicine, when you break it down, it literally means thyroid stimulating hormone. Yeah. That's all it is. Yeah. So once it's released, it stimulates your hormone. Cortisol can block TSH production, which means you're right from the start, right from your brain, you're not telling your thyroid to work properly. So that's one way. Yeah. People wonder when they have elevated cortisol and why we talk about it so often. And especially if you're a woman, if you've had this problem for a while, you will have a thyroid issue. You'll have symptoms of thyroid. Now, you may have a lot of symptoms of thyroid, or you have a few symptoms of thyroid. But regardless, if you have a problem with cortisol for a long time, you're going to have eventually an issue with thyroid. And so the first thing it does is it blocks that TSH, but that's not it. That's not the only way it does. Cortisol lays the hammer down on the thyroid. It really does, because it tells the brain to make less TSH, so your thyroid stimulated. And what it also does, the thyroid makes a whole bunch of hormones, right? T1, T2, T3, T4 are the main one it makes. And a majority of it is T4. Now, we don't want to bore you to death, but T3 is the active form of the thyroid hormone. So you make a ton of T4. That T4 has to be converted into T3.
Where is it converted?
It's converted in the liver, which is why insulin can affect the thyroid, right?
Exactly. That's another issue.
That's another issue. There's a lot of things that can affect the thyroid, but insulin is one of them. But what's interesting is, so you convert T4 to T3. Here's the thing. Cortisol decreases the conversion of T4 to T3. So now your brain is telling your thyroid to not work as well, and you're not making as much T3. So, I mean, again, it can hammer your thyroid. It can really affect your thyroid as well. And here's another thing as well. It increases something what they call reverse T3. So every hormone has a mechanism in place to tell it to stop, right? So when you have a lot of this RT3, this reverse T3 circulating, that's telling your thyroid we don't need any more hormone right now. So you can kind of you can stop making it, right? So cortisol tells TSH to go down. It drastically decreases the conversion of T4 to T3. And then it also increases your reverse T3, so it's telling you to stop making it in the first place.
So now your thyroid has just gone to a crawl, right? It's into a crawl.
So you can see why elevated cortisol hurts your thyroid. And why a lot of times their thyroid symptoms go away a lot of times when they start to really deal with the cortisol aspect of things as well.
Big time.
But again, like anything else, once your thyroid is affected and it hasn't been functioning properly for a while, well, it's interesting because then nutritionally, you have to support the thyroid as well. It needs the nutrients to get back healthy again after, right? So that's what makes that interesting. All right, and there's another thing that as well. We have a program that we had done a while ago called the Metabolic Storm, right? And we really talk about the effect that cortisol, thyroid, and estrogen have on your body. And here's the thing. Cortisol is kind of the starting point for a lot of hormonal issues in people. I mean, you can enter the metabolic storm with the thyroid, which will affect your cortisol, which can affect your estrogen, or you can enter it. Any one of those three can start you off that path. But cortisol does it the most direct, fastest way. It really does.
And what is the biggest issue? We mentioned this the last podcast. What is the biggest issue in the world today? I mean, in medicine, right? In healthcare, what's the fastest growing? I mean, diabetes is one of them. But what is it in psychiatric health? What is it? It's anxiety.
Yeah, anxiety
is the new depression.
That's right.
It's amazing how prevalent this is in our society today.
You know, and it is. I really spent a lot of time trying to just think of all the different reasons why that is. And it's funny, if you even sit back and kind of self-evaluate, you'll even notice that you're more stressed or anxious than you used to be for whatever reason. It's the weirdest thing. And it's one of those things where, so you can imagine what that's doing to our biochemistry, which, well, we know what it's doing, right? It's causing a real imbalance of cortisol, and it's causing a lot of issues, right? But you're right. And I guess the last thing we just want to mention quickly when it comes to why it can mess up a woman's hormones badly, because then cortisol will increase estrogen dominance as well through a whole bunch of different mechanisms. One of the things that happens when you have a lot of cortisol, you have a lot of insulin, you have a lot of inflammation, you tend to store more belly fat, and then estrogen.
Belly fat does what?
Well, and that's the thing, right? Because you store estrogen. Estrogen's released from fat. The more fat, the more estrogen. You become estrogen dominant. And then what's interesting is that the more estrogen dominant you become, that will also basically block T4 to T3. So it really, the thyroid, the reason why a lot of women have thyroid symptoms, and the reason why that's a high search query on Google, is because a problem everywhere else in their hormones will eventually whack the thyroid. It eventually, the thyroid is
gets
always
hammered.
The victim. Always. If you have cortisol, it hurts your thyroid. If you have estrogen dominance, it hurts your thyroid. So that's why. That's why women have these really epidemic issues of thyroid symptoms, because everything eventually affects your thyroid. Why? Because your thyroid controls everything. So eventually these things will affect your thyroid. So it's just fascinating stuff, right? And it's just so consistent with all the symptoms that people are experiencing today when it comes to their hormones. And they can look at these things. They're like, I find this interesting because somebody will email us. They're like, yeah, I looked up the symptoms of thyroid. I have those. And then I looked up the symptoms of adrenal fatigue, and I have those as well. And then, oh, yeah, I also noticed I have a lot of symptoms of too much estrogen. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. But we're here to tell you that that makes a lot of sense. Not only does it make a lot of sense, there are a lot of women who are going through the exact same thing. And then they go see their family doctor, and their family doctor, to be honest, is just confused. I mean, it falls so far outside of what they normally deal with that it becomes a real issue. So then women get really frustrated because their hormones are a mess. They know they have thyroid problems, but they just can't get those answers. So listen, we're here to tell you that it makes sense. It does. Yeah. And a lot of times you control that cortisol, and you really get that cortisol down to where it should be. You start getting a better night's sleep, and you reset that circadian rhythm. You get those hormones flowing when they should be and when they shouldn't be, and it's amazing.
The growth hormone starts being produced again. Your cells at the cellular level, your mitochondria. We didn't even talk about that. I think we did a little bit last time, where your ATP, which is, your energy coming out of your battery packs within your cells, can regenerate. Again, we mentioned it last week, but chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and a lot of these things are all that metabolic storm. They're just so messed up.
Yeah, they're just extensions. It really is. A lot of these have the same root problem, but they present themselves differently. Because if somebody has chronic fatigue, they have a lot of hormonal issues.
Yeah.
Their hormones are a mess.
Oh, they're a mess.
They're a mess.
They're in a major breakdown.
A lot of people that have chronic fatigue are really what we would call a category 5 storm, right? Their hormones are just so messed up, it's affecting every aspect of their body, and their sleep included. And then they can't stay asleep, fall asleep. They don't get restful sleep because they're not going through all the cycles of sleep, not getting enough REM. I mean, it's just all connected. It's fascinating stuff. And I mean, you've spent a lot of time over the years asking a lot of questions and doing a lot of research, reading a ton of stuff, and a lot of experience talking with people. And you've really gone ahead of the game when it comes to hormones. But again, just that's what you do, right? That's what you do. So anyways, I know we gave a ton of information again today. We want to thank you for listening to this episode. If you have any questions, you can email us at info@martinclinic.com. Also, every Thursday morning, you do a Facebook Live where you answer a ton of questions.
Yep.
We have a newsletter as well. If you want to join our newsletter, just go to martinclinic.com. You can join our newsletter there. We also have a private Facebook group where it's a great community of people, awesome people in there. It's a fairly active group, so it's a lot of fun. So you can go as well and request access to join our private Facebook group. So again, we want to thank you for listening. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Doctor Is In podcast from martinclinic.com. If you have any questions, you can reach us at info@martinclinic.com. If you're not a newsletter subscriber, you can head to our website and sign up for free. We also have a private Facebook group that you can join. It's a community of awesome people. Finally, I do a Facebook Live every Thursday morning at 8:30. Join us again next week for a new episode.